Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Gabriel Emani. I'm the director of the Global Policy Institute in the Bellarmine College of Liberal Arts at Loyola Marymount University. And before we start with today's event, I want to thank BCLA Dean Robin Crabtree and the Dean's Office for their help with the event. And I also want to thank Angelina Lin and Matt Lamantia. They are both LMU students, they're GPI fellows, and today they're gonna take the lead on the conversation. And talking about the conversation, I think I've been rarely as excited as I am today to introduce our guest. We are very excited to have Clarissa Ward, who is CNN Chief International Correspondent. Clarissa Ward spent almost 20 years on the front lines. She reported from the war in Syria, in Iraq, in Afghanistan. She was in Egypt earlier this year. She was the first international journalist, Western journalist able to enter Myanmar after the military coup. And throughout her career, she won the most important journalism awards, including 2 Peabody Awards, 2 duPont-Columbia Awards, 2 Edward Murrow Awards, and several Emmy Awards. I believe most recently 2 News Emmy for her investigation into the poisoning of Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny. Clarissa Ward just launched a new podcast, Tug of War, and I listened to the first episode yesterday, highly recommended. And she's also the author of On All Fronts. It's a wonderful book, highly recommended. And I want to highlight a couple of points that really stood out to me as I was reading the book. The first one is the exceptional bravery that she displays in her job. When we see her on CNN, she makes everything look effortless and neat and easy. By reading the book, we really see how much work goes into reporting and how dangerous it is. She literally survived bombings in Syria and Iraq. She had to run for her life on the front lines in Syria with bullets flying. She was chased by an angry mob in China. She traveled to Yemen. I believe she was 7 months pregnant at the time to report on the forgotten war. And so thank you, Clarissa, for literally risking your life to bring to life the stories of people who would otherwise be forgotten. And by doing this, and this is something that also struck me, she really becomes a bridge between very distant worlds. She becomes a translator between the Western world, where most of us live in, and then these distant conflict areas that would be otherwise, again, forgotten. And I think she has the incredible ability to humanize the people whose stories she's telling. These people come to life for us in the book. We learn their names, we learn their struggle, their feelings. And so these people become real men and women and children. And by doing this, Clarissa Ward makes the horrors of war impossible to ignore because they become real, tangible. And the very last thing, I think I was struck by her honesty in the book. She openly talks about her vulnerability or fear in the conflict zone. She talks about some of the things that happened to her, including harassment by Gaddafi's son in Russia, for instance, the challenges while traveling pregnant. I don't remember if it was Greenland or Denmark. There's a very funny scene in a tent at night. I won't go into detail here. And she also talks about the struggle and the fight against depression after coming back from Syria. So as you can tell, I couldn't be more excited to welcome Clarissa Ward here at GPI today. Welcome, Clarissa.
Thank you so much for such a lovely introduction, Gabriele. I really appreciate it. It's my pleasure to be here with you.
Okay, now I'll let Matt and Angelina take the lead on today's conversation.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Clarissa. I just wanted to first thank you on behalf of Angelina, myself, GPI, and LMU. It's a real privilege to have you here today and to be able to ask questions. Got to say, I love the book.
Yay.
It's deeply interesting, and I love how personal it is. It makes all the issues really accessible, but really communicating their gravity just beautifully and gracefully. So everyone in the audience, I really recommend this one. Pick it up, and it's just a fantastic story. So quick note on the format of our event before we begin. We have a few topics that we'd love to get through so our audience can get a broader sense of your career in life. And obviously with our time constraint, we have about an hour. It's going to be difficult to get, everything, obviously, but we're going to dedicate a few minutes to about 3 or 4 topics. Angelina and I will ask questions for about 30 minutes, and then we're going to turn it over to an audience Q&A which will be fielded through Zoom. So I'd like to remind the participants also that the questions will be raised through the Q&A feature on the bottom toolbar, not through the chat. So that's how we'll be able to see those. So once through the chat won't be answered, and hopefully we'll be able to get to a lot of them. So Clarissa, I'm sure this is a question that you get a lot, but where in the world are you right now?
You're lucky. You've caught me in a rare moment where I'm at home. I'm in London. I got back from Afghanistan just last Wednesday. So I've been home for about a week, and I'm going next week to Rome to attend the G20. So I won't be home for a super long amount of time, but still it's really, really, really good to be home.
Yeah, I'm sure, especially considering the conflict zones that you frequent. We will ask about Afghanistan, but first, in your 2 recent trips also, but first just wanted to jump into kind of a brief introduction. Seeing as our audience is mostly undergrads, I'd like to begin by asking, how you got your start in journalism. In your book, you give a brief glimpse into your upbringing, growing up in New York townhouses, and then onto boarding school in England and prestigious high school in London, and then obviously Yale. So how did you get from boarding schools in Yale to conflict zones?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely wasn't an obvious trajectory, I would say. I was studying comparative literature at school. I was studying French, Italian, and Russian literature. And I had no inkling that I was going to be a journalist until my senior year of college. 9/11 happened, which again, it's like very crazy to me that none of you guys were born yet when 9/11 happened. But the world was a really different place before 9/11. And it was one of those moments that like everybody remembers exactly where they were, what they were doing, because certainly in the US and indeed in many places, I think everybody's world was kind of turned upside down by 9/11. And a lot of people felt called to service. A lot of people signed up with the military. I guess I felt called to a different kind of service. I felt a little bit ashamed that I hadn't been more engaged with what was going on in the world. And I felt that because I had had an unusual upbringing and had traveled a lot and loved languages and was able to be something of a chameleon and adapt to wherever I was, that I wanted to go and act as like a translator between different worlds, because I fundamentally saw this heinous attack as the product of a just massive breakdown of communication, and also a real lack of humanization and mutual understanding. So that's how the ideals started out. And then of course you graduate from college and realize like you actually have to now work out how you're going to do this. And it's a tough industry to get into, especially if you want to be in front of the camera, you want to be in the field. It's highly competitive. A lot of people want to do it. And there's no clear path. I started out by doing an internship at CNN in Moscow. And then from there, CNN couldn't offer me a job right away on the news desk in New York, but Fox News did on the overnight assignment desk. And there were a number of reasons I didn't want to work at Fox. Some of them are probably pretty obvious. I also didn't particularly want to work on the overnight assignment desk. But I was 23 and I was in a hurry to get places, and I was hungry for information and learn. And I just didn't want to sit at home for another 3 months waiting for a job with CNN to materialize. And I knew enough to know that I could still learn a lot from Fox about the way news gathering works and the way television news works. And I did. I learned a huge amount. You're given a lot of responsibility really early on when you're on the overnight assignment desk, because nobody else is awake during those hours, but the rest of the world is. So the Iraq invasion happened. I was talking to like our Baghdad bureau every morning. And it just confirmed to me that like this was where I wanted to be and this was what I wanted to do. And so I continued to press my bosses relentlessly to let me go into the field. Eventually, because the war in Iraq was, obviously a huge story, but at the same time, people were tired of going. Staff reporters were just burnt out on it, and it was so hot and it was so dangerous. And so perhaps because not that many people wanted to go anymore, when I was 25 years old in 2005 in June, I got my first break to go and work as a producer in the Baghdad bureau for 6 weeks. And then after that, I quit my job and moved to Beirut, and I started working as a freelancer. So that's sort of the abridged version of how I got started.
Well, thank you. I must ask, I mean, when you had this desire to get out to Baghdad and to get to the conflict, but did you really, I mean, how is it most different, or what was the most different thing that you didn't expect, like what was the most unexpected part of that as a new producer?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I mean, first of all, nothing can prepare you for going to war, right? So you think you know about war because, obviously I've been reading a ton of books and watching a lot of documentaries and movies and trying to immerse myself in learning more about these war zones. But when you're actually in a war zone, it's an entirely different experience. And I think in the beginning, it's very thrilling because it feels like you're in a movie a little bit. Like everything is new, everything is exciting, everything is something that you've never experienced. You've only ever seen it on TV or read about it in books. And suddenly you're living through all of that. There is a very important and kind of seismic moment, I think, in most reporters' lives who do this work consistently, where the reality of war presents itself and really punches a hole in the myth of the kind of the excitement, the glamour, the drama. And suddenly you're like, for me, that happened in Baghdad on my second trip. Again, I was still 25 years old. I really knew, very, very little about anything, which is not to say that you guys don't know much about anything. But as a reporter, I really very, very, I had very little experience. And there was a triple suicide car bombing attack on our hotel. And we were very lucky that we made it out alive, because essentially the third truck that came in that had the most amount of explosives that was going to just drive like into the lobby of the hotel, basically, because the first two bombs had basically created huge holes in the perimeter. Like they blew up like blast walls, and that created a space for this massive cement mixer truck to go in and laden with explosives. But what happened was that he got stuck on this razor wire, concertina wire it's called. And you could see the truck like lurching back and forth, trying to just get past the razor wire, but the axle of the truck was just caught in it. And you knew the driver, who was the bomber, obviously, is making a calculation, right? Like, how quickly do I blow myself up? Because I know that because there was American military. We were in the Palestine Hotel, the Sheraton Hotel was here. There's American military there. And so, they're making the calculation, okay, an American sniper is going to take me out like any second now. I really want to get further past this razor wire because to inflict maximum damage. But then I think at a certain point, he understood that he was going to get shot if he didn't make a decision quickly. So he blew himself up. And massive explosion. I mean, unlike anything to this day that I've ever experienced. And like the doors blew off hinges, and like there was smoke everywhere, and like parts of the ceiling were like crumbling, and like people going around with like bloodied cuts on their faces. And it was my first time realizing that like it's not a game, and it's not fun, and it's not glamorous, and it's not exciting. It's like it's hell, and like and people are dying. And it's horror. And I had a very real understanding for the first time that like I could die quite easily. And so that is a really sobering moment, I think, in any journalist's life. But it's an important one to go through, because it gives you a much more serious and sober sense of the gravity of what it is that you're doing and covering.
Yeah, thank you. It sounds, I mean, it's incredible to hear about, but I can't even get my head around it. And I'm sure that's what you're saying. Nothing will prepare you for the reality of that. And there's nothing that can really convey it well. I mean, you convey it brilliantly, but I'm sure there's something that we're not grasping. But we'll get back to conflict zones in a few minutes. Right now, I'm going to pass it over to Angelina to ask some questions about Afghanistan. So thanks so much for your answers.
So to continue the topic of war zones, we want to talk about your recent trip to Afghanistan. And you recently you covered the fall of Kabul, and many of us saw the scenes of Afghans rushing to the airport trying to leave the country during the US withdrawal. And you were there on the ground as the chaos was unfolding. So can you tell us more about what that was like? And were there things that were happening that we really didn't see on TV, but you witnessed in the streets?
Mm-hmm. It's a good question. First of all, I'm also just delighted. I've worked out how to turn my video off so I don't have to look at myself anymore. Because if you noticed, I was kind of like doing like this. Now I can just look at you guys, which makes me feel much more comfortable and less self-conscious. Because even after all these years of being on television, I still find it very unnerving to like see myself. So Afghanistan, the airport. You know, it's a pretty rare thing in a reporter's career that you are in a moment where you're literally watching history unfold in real time, and you feel there's a thrill undeniably that comes with seeing that and experiencing that, but there's also this awesome sense of responsibility. You're kind of responsible along with your colleagues for writing a first draft on history in a sense and what's happening. And so we're in a difficult situation because it was obviously dangerous, and I think we were among the very, very few Western journalists who were out on the streets and reporting in those first early days when the Taliban took power. I felt a little more comfortable doing that because I had just spent time with the Taliban and I was working closely with an Afghan colleague who had spent a lot of time with them. But the scenes at the airport were just horrendous on many levels. You had the sort of security concerns of just the chaos that was unfolding and how do you try to do your work and stay safe in that environment. Every time we would stop and stand still for more than 5 minutes, we would be completely swarmed by people, ordinary Afghan citizens, desperately trying to show us their paperwork. Look, here's my green card. Look, here's my certificate of employment. Here, I was a US translator. I did this, I did that. I have my CIV, my special immigration visa. And all of them looking to you as a journalist in that moment, not just to amplify their story and give their voices a platform, which is our job, but also to help them in that moment. Like they're like literally asking me, how do I get into the airport? How do I get past the Taliban checkpoint? And the Taliban guys are standing 100 yards away from us and they're brandishing whips and truncheons, and they are like incredibly hopped up and irascible and very aggressive, firing in the air like on a very regular basis, sometimes firing into the crowd. People are petrified. And so you're trying to balance all of these like competing issues on the ground between security, doing justice to the story, but then also just being a human being and like taking a moment to listen to someone. Because, you know, what you have to understand in war zones, and Afghanistan was a really clear example of this as well. It's like sometimes people just need to feel heard. Sometimes people just need you to stand there for 5 minutes and hear them, even if you can't help them. It's just that act of bearing witness, of listening to them. And that can be, I believe, a form of doing the job as well. It doesn't necessarily end up on the evening news, but it definitely informs your reporting. And I also feel like a sense of duty as well, honestly, especially as an American, to where I can take the moment and listen to someone's story, even if I know I can't help them. And by the way, as a journalist, it's not my role to help them. But still, as a human being, to kind of bear witness to what they're going through and to let them have that catharsis of talking through what it is they're experiencing. And so that was very challenging at the airport because there was so much heartache and so much bitterness and so much anger and so much pain and so much fear. It's a lot to, first of all, capture it for an international audience as a kind of marker of history, and also as a human being to try to absorb it and be able to respond to people in a human way.
Thank you. the weight of that experience and balancing it with your work and the duty you feel as a journalist, but also as a human being, it's completely unimaginable. So what do you think is the most pressing issues to Afghani citizens right now? And what do you think needs to be heard in Afghanistan?
I mean, first of all, I think there's always a danger, and, you know, I've probably fallen, you know, into this trap sometimes as well. Like we're telling like one side of the story a little bit. And there's no question that in the days after the Taliban took control, we were really looking at Kabul and what was happening in Kabul and the mayhem at the airport and the fears. There are many other parts of Afghanistan where people were literally celebrating in the streets that the US had left and that the Taliban was in control of the country. And I do think it's important that the world knows that too, that it's not that the US's 20-year occupation of Afghanistan was seen universally in Afghanistan as this kind of like benevolent, wonderful thing. Many people associated the US presence with like continued bloodshed and drone strikes and Afghan police who operated with impunity, who arbitrary detentions, allegations of torture at the hands of Afghan security services. And so for a lot of people, it was a good riddance situation. But I think no matter who you are in Afghanistan right now, there are two things I would say. Number one, the security situation is better, right? There is not fighting across the country right now. America is gone. The Taliban have, assumed a different role. They're no longer an insurgency. They are actually trying to govern and now fighting an insurgency in the form of ISIS-K. But you can drive now. Like you couldn't drive over large parts of Afghanistan before because it's like the Taliban controlled this part of the highway and you couldn't go from one territory to the other. And now there's definitely an improvement in the security. Although I will say that these recent string of bombings at the hands of ISIS-K raise real questions about how sustainable that is. Also, though, there's like very real questions about like whether the Taliban can effectively govern. And I'm not just talking, I'll mention the women's rights thing in a moment, but like even just broader issues. Do they understand how to run a country? It's been a long time since they had any experience doing that. And they don't have the backing of the international community, and the funding that Afghanistan has become very dependent on has been frozen. And they do not seem willing to show flexibility in terms of having a more inclusive government, having people from the former government, getting technocrats on board. It's much more based on their picks, sort of ideological, no women, no ethnic minorities, no people from the former government, et cetera, which I think is worrisome. You're also dealing with a potential major economic crisis, which is already unfolding as a result of that aid being frozen. And then on top of that, if you're living in the cities, if your life improved over the last 20 years, if you were a woman who was able to go out and get a job and participate in public life and get a PhD and have a role as a member of parliament and start a radio station, be a television star, like whatever it is, women undeniably, not across the whole country, but in many parts of it, made huge strides in the last 20 years in Afghanistan. And that has just all but disappeared now. So for many people who benefited from some of the improvements that occurred under the US's tenure in Afghanistan, whether that's improvements in education, in mortality, in literacy, in economic opportunities, the situation is like very, very bleak right now.
Thank you. So this transition of governments is extremely complex and definitely deserves more time to be discussed, but to cover more bases, we'll have to conclude this section on Afghanistan, and hopefully we'll be able to answer more questions about it in our Q&A section, during our Q&A section of the webinar. And I'll be passing it over to Matt now, who will be discussing Syria.
Yeah, I'm sure the situation in Afghanistan has some parallels to Syria, but in many ways, the Syrian war was obviously a much more bloody event than the recent Taliban takeover. First, I'd just like to applaud, thank you for the risks you took to bring us your phenomenal coverage on Syria. I mean, I've watched it growing up my whole life. I mean, it's how it feels to me because I'm not that, 21. But but also, from your book, from what I've gathered, the risks like can't be understated, and the coverage, made a real difference in the issues present here at home. So I just reading the book, I get a sense that you're deeply connected with the people that you spend time with in conflict zones. And so what's the most difficult thing to communicate about these people in Syria, or really in any of the coverage?
I think often the most difficult thing to communicate is that people are people, no matter where they are from, no matter what God they pray to, no matter what color or ethnicity, people are people. And that can be very difficult. We tend in the media, and also I think as Americans, to really try to frame things a lot in black and white, and there's good guys and bad guys. And when you spend a lot of time in these places, you realize that to do this kind of work is to live in the gray a lot, and more than black and white, you see a lot of gray. And so you will definitely come across people in war zones who are evil, and you will come across some psychopaths, and but you will also come across good people who may espouse ideologies that are alien to you, or really challenge your values, or you fundamentally disagree with on many levels. And I just think it's been very instructive for me with my experiences dealing with people in the Taliban, dealing with people in groups in Syria like Ahrar Hashem or Jabhat al-Nusra, or some of these more like militant Islamist organizations. And the tendency, I look at the language that Russia uses, and it's like, people are terrorists, or they're, pro-democracy, and there's kind of nothing in between. And the reality is that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. And another thing I've really learned over the years is that it's very difficult to judge people until you've walked a mile in their shoes, which is something we're always told, like when we're growing up. But you really see that in war zones. And in Syria, it would make me livid, because people would be like, oh, they're becoming militant, they're becoming radicalized. And I'm like, if you're on the ground and you're being bombed day in and day out, and you're sifting bodies through the rubble, if your whole family is killed, your baby is killed, do you not think that that hardens you and changes the way you think about the world? Do you not think that will bring you to your knees, and you will feel that the only thing you have left is God and the people who are willing to brave those bombs with you? It doesn't mean you're a lunatic, or you're a zealot, or you're this or that. It means this is all you've got to hold on to right now. And so I get a little I think we can be a little judgmental sometimes about decisions that people make, and just understanding the sort of like how these groups emerge. Even with a group like ISIS, when ISIS first emerged, and everyone was up in arms about how evil they were, and this is like, and don't get me wrong, ISIS were very evil, are very evil, because I do think they still exist, although not in the same context. But ISIS grew out of the vacuum that was created by the war in Syria. ISIS grew out of, in no small part, the US occupation in Iraq, and Camp Bucca, which was a US military prison, is where Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS, sort of, got a lot of his ideological training and experience, and where he joined forces with Ba'athist, and they came up with this kind of hybrid terror nation state theory concept. So it's just, I think sometimes we want to see things in a very simplistic way. And the reality is that life is much more complex and much more nuanced than that. And that is why I believe it is fundamentally important that our job is not just to give people a platform to mouth off, propaganda, but to listen to people, even if their ideas make us uncomfortable, and to try to understand what this thinking or this ideology or this way of behaving on the ground is a product of and where it came from, and trying to give it more context and more humanity, so that we don't end up just like going around in circles. Like sometimes I really feel like, and that's the way history works, I get it. But it does feel like sometimes we don't learn anything from even recent mistakes. So yeah, I'm not sure if I've totally answered your question there, but
Absolutely.
yeah, people
Yeah.
are people.
It's honestly insane, reading the book and hearing the story, how people change in these conflict zones, especially when the Syrian rebel groups were swallowed up in a sense by ISIS. I just wanted to ask, just for our audience's sake, if you could tell us a little bit about what it was like to be on the ground there, the horrors of the war almost. I mean, I'm sorry to ask you this, but what was that like? What kind of conditions create these changes?
I mean, I've been to a lot of conflict zones, and I will say that I've never been as terrified in my life as I was in Syria. I mean, you're just like perpetually terrified. There's nowhere to run to. There's no safe haven. There's no, normally there are rules in war. And with the Taliban, like there were rules. The fighting took place at night for the most part. During the day, you had more access to like cross front lines. There was a sort of code of conduct. And I'm not saying both sides didn't break it on a regular basis, but there were rules. Whereas with Bashar al-Assad in Syria, there were no rules. You could gas civilians, you could dump explosives out of the back of a helicopter onto just like a random densely populated area. You could shell a hospital, you could bomb a hospital, nothing was off limits. And was a war of no consequences. You could do whatever you wanted and no one was going to punish you for it. I mean, the international community might stand on the sidelines and wring their hands and issue some damning statements, but nothing was going to happen materially. And so it was absolutely petrifying to be on the ground in that context, and just like this barrage of artillery and fighter jets and all the rest of it, constantly, like, you're just in a state of heightened fear and alert. And also, I'd never covered a war where like every single trip I made, it's like the people I would leave and 2 weeks later, it's like, oh, the people we stayed with got killed. Oh, the woman we interviewed for that piece got kidnapped. Oh, your friend has been executed. Oh, this person was killed by a shell. That person ended up in prison. And so it just was so ruthless as a war and so relentless that it did become very difficult as a journalist to keep covering it, both from a security point of view in terms of the risks that you had to take, but also in terms of emotionally, like how many times you could be like bludgeoned like that. And that's more reason again why like I feel very protective over Syrian people when I hear, I don't know, analysts in a faraway place opining about terrorism and radicalism. And I'm like, go and spend some time on the ground in, rebel held Aleppo during the worst of the siege, where people were being starved and bombed, and then talk to me about radicalization.
Yeah, it just seems like such a nightmare. There was an idea that you put forward in the book that really struck me in the midst of all this. And it's the idea that life means more in conflict zones and in Syria amidst this conflict. And I'll quote from the book, the colors were more vivid, experiences more raw, and that life reverberated with a sense of profundity. So what was it that gives it this quality? It just seems like it doesn't fit.
Yeah, I mean, people will always ask, why do you go to war zones and what keeps you going back and what's the addiction? And every correspondent has a different thing that they are addicted to. And for me, it is, as you as you just quoted from the book, this idea that the stakes are so much higher in war zones. And so everything is rendered more meaningful. And there's no such thing as like a casual throwaway moment, because even a casual throwaway moment seen in the context of war and sacrifice and pain, it takes on this added significance. So something as simple as like my driver trying to calm my nerves in Aleppo when we're there under all this shelling and we're sitting in a car and he gives me a little piece of chocolate. Like I would never remember that at home. Like a driver gave me a piece of chocolate. I mean, it's a nice thing to do, but in the context of that moment, it was like profound and beautiful and touching. And I remember the way that chocolate tasted and how it had a visceral effect and how it did calm me, because I understood the kind of loving gesture that it was to offer it to me. And I was so grateful in that moment of abject fear, of being paralyzed by fear. I was so grateful for that small act of kindness. And it's difficult in the world that we live in to be that deeply in the moment, to be that mindful and that conscious of every small act of kindness. And it's something I really do try to bring home with me, because it is one of the most profound things about spending time in a war zone, when you're not constantly thinking 10 days, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 3 months into the future, and you're in the moment. And that is kind of everything. And so it's a lot of the noise of our world in the West and of consumerism and celebrity cult. It's just like, whoop, it's just gone. And there is something very addictive about that, because it feels like it's a chaotic space in some ways, but it's also a much more distilled space.
Yeah, and that's something I feel like it's very difficult to get, you know, as observers here in the West. Angelina has some more questions about journalism and your experiences there, so I'm going to pass it over to her. And I appreciate your discussion on Syria.
Thank you.
Thank you. So your role as a journalist, you mentioned that listening and trying to contextualize and humanize like the violence, the happenings, and the emotions that people are feeling on the ground. I think that's really important, and I'm really glad to hear that that's what's included in your storytelling. So what I want to ask about is your role as a woman journalist in conflict zones. So this comes with its own sets of risks, in addition to the risks that are experienced by your male colleagues. And what are some of these risks? And in your experience, what has being a woman journalist in this field meant for conflict reporting?
I think that being a woman, I have never viewed it as a disadvantage. If anything, I have often found it has helped me reporting, particularly in very conservative areas where Western male colleagues might be viewed as mercenaries or soldiers or spies. Often as a woman, I like to joke that it's a great thing to be underestimated. And so I am seen as less threatening in many scenarios. I can sit in the back of a car and pretend to fall asleep and drive through a checkpoint. I can wear a headscarf and attract much less attention. And I also have, in deeply conservative societies, I have access to 50% of the population that my male colleagues do not. And I think this was a real problem with conflict reporting for a long time, is that there weren't enough women doing it, which meant that you really were hearing 80%, if not 90% of what you were hearing about any of these conflicts or places was coming from the voices of men and their opinions and their feelings on the ground. So I'm very pleased to see now that there are so many female journalists doing amazing work in conflict zones. And I think there's definitely a sisterhood among us reporters. I think there are fewer of us who are also mothers, which for me has presented another level of, well, challenges, obviously, but also I do think it's changed in some ways my reporting. And and made it more empathetic and more humanizing. And now I often wonder to myself, if there were more mothers covering war, what that would look like, how that might shift the dialogue or the conversation on some of these conflicts. If at all. I'm not like committed to that theory. I just think it's an interesting idea.
It's really amazing to hear that you're able to bring these like more voices to light. And as a woman myself, it's really great to hear about the sisterhood amongst women journalists. And just to finish off this section, you've nearly had 2 decades of experience in journalism. So we were wondering what advice you would have for young people, especially students who want to become journalists.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I'm always like thrilled when I meet students who want to become journalists, because like it's like, you know, buckle up. It's going to be a bumpy ride. We have a lot of challenges facing us. We are facing a torrent of misinformation and disinformation. Public trust in the media has been grievously eroded. And so it's a really important moment to like step up to the plate and make it clear that it is a beautiful thing that we have a much greater diversity of voices telling stories. And I think that the ecosystem of social media has really allowed that to thrive. And we've seen citizen journalists on the ground in Syria and Afghanistan and Myanmar do some of the bravest and most important reporting. And so we're just getting a much more nuanced and fuller and more vivid picture by having that greater diversity of voices. Of course, what comes with that greater diversity of voices is like competing voices, competing narratives. And I don't think that's a problem as long as we are all on the same page about sticking to facts. And if we are all using a sort of basic framework of ethics in doing our jobs. The problem is when you have other like nefarious actors who are engaging in willful misinformation and disinformation. So I do think there's like a huge amount of responsibility that comes with journalism at the moment. I'm very cognizant of this. It's like, we can't get things wrong right now. No one will remember who got it first. Everyone will remember who was wrong. I remember Scott Pelley telling me that years ago, and it's a really sound piece of advice. The other piece of advice I would just say is that for me, if I had to like boil it down to like one quality that journalism is fundamentally about, it's about listening. And we really don't do enough of this in our society. And even if you watch like, you know, certain news channels, occasionally you will see people kind of like shouting over each other and they're not really listening. They're kind of waiting to speak and then they're saying their thing. And we definitely are in a moment in society where it's all about like who can shout their opinion the loudest. And that honestly is not terribly helpful, or it serves a certain purpose, but that's not the purpose of a journalist. The purpose of a journalist is to sit and listen to everyone, whether you like their ideas or you don't, whether they challenge your values or they adhere to, you know, listen to them, have an open mind, challenge them 100%, but listen to them. That's part of your job. Your job is not to make pronouncements about where that person is on the morality scale or make judgments about the decisions that they have made. Your job is to give them a chance to have their voices heard, but also to give others a chance to understand them better. That doesn't mean you make everyone look like an angel at all. Like if someone's an ass, let them be an ass, right? But the way you're going to do that is not by trying to trick them or bamboozle them. It's by having a really, I would argue, a fair conversation with them. And, you know, my mother always uses the expression, like, you give them enough rope to hang themselves, which, you know, I mean, I'm not sure a journalist should be advocating that, but sometimes in an interview that is what you do. You don't jump in with the judgment and you let them really express who they truly are. But the only way you're going to get to that place is by listening. So you have to be willing to listen. And the only other thing I would say is if you want to do this job, you can't be a picky eater, because you're going to be traveling all over the world. You're going to be missing funerals and parties and weddings and important days for, you know, your social life is going to be a mess. Your love life is almost certainly at one stage going to be a mess. Like, this is a job that requires a huge amount of personal sacrifice, you know, because you can't just dip in and out. When you're in, and you're in for 6 weeks. And when you're starting out, you're going to be, I did Christmas in Afghanistan, I did Christmas in Iraq, I did Christmas in Moscow. I mean, you name it, I've done it. And that's part of the gig. So it's not for everyone.
Thank you so much. That was very, very insightful. And journalism is truly an admirable career to be in. And we hope that those who go into it in the future are carrying that responsibility with them, and that's the duty they feel with it. So now I'll be passing it back to Matt, who has some questions about the international news environment.
I just have one. We're getting to the point where we should move on to the Q&A, so hopefully can make this brief. But it seems that, to your point about listening as a journalist and living in this gray area and not judging people when you're there, it seems that the news establishment, the kind of the news environment in the US is almost committed to doing that, to making things very black and white and simple. And you mentioned in the book that you felt that the coverage that on world news was a little sensationalized or graphics heavy to take this issues on seriously. And so I just wanted to ask what you would change about the American network's coverage of international stories, and how can we make the gray area bigger or grayer or more here?
I mean, I think what's so great now is that there are so many. I just always advocate to people, don't get your news from only one source. The days of like coming home at 6 p.m. and turning on Tom Brokaw at 6:30. And I mean, don't get me wrong, watch NBC News, watch ABC, watch CBS. They all do fine broadcasts, but that can't be the only place where you're consuming information. They're giving you a very specific thing. But you also should be, checking out documentaries on Frontline on PBS, or listening to NPR, or reading whatever publications you would normally dip into, and having read the Wall Street Journal and Mother Jones, have a rich and diverse ecosystem that you're listening to. Don't fall in the trap of only listening to what you want to hear and ideas that you want to hear echoed back to yourself. I'm really lucky because I work at CNN and we have 24 hours. Jeff Zucker, my boss, always likes to say, we got 24 hours a day to fill. So they are willing to take the time to do, a 11-minute piece on the Taliban, or an hour-long feature on Afghanistan, or whatever the story might be. I think that you also, as journalists, have to step up to the plate, though. It's not enough for a cause or a story to be worthy, okay? We are also in the business of telling stories, okay? So your job is to make those stories compelling, not by sensationalizing them, but making them accessible, making them human, building up characters, finding those moments that are not necessarily on the face of it exceptional, but say a lot about a situation with just one kind of flicker of a facial expression or an exchange between you and someone you're interviewing. So you have to really hone your skills to make these stories accessible and indeed like something that people actively want to consume. And so it's not enough to be like, this is important, people are dying. Okay, we get that. There's a lot of important stories and there's a lot of people dying. Make me want to watch this story. Make me care about this story. Make me feel connected to this story. That is also your responsibility as a journalist.
Yeah, absolutely. It's all so interesting and seems so difficult to do, because things just sometimes don't seem real to us, as the audience here. We look at numbers and places that we've never been to, and numbers that are just staggering, and it's like, how do we make sense of these things in reality? But I must say that just doing my research for this interview too, I mean, you've done a fantastic job, and I'd like to thank you for joining us with this part of the Q&A, and for all the wonderful work as well. At this time, I'm going to pass it over to Angelina. We're going to do audience Q&A. So just as a reminder to the audience, the Q&A feature on Zoom is how you put those questions in. So Angelina, take it away.
Thank you, Matt. So back to Afghanistan. You were corrected a meme. You corrected a meme on Twitter and showed two screen caps of you. One was where you were not wearing a headscarf in a private compound and being fully covered in Kabul, which the meme did not distinguish. So has fact checking gotten more difficult over your career? And do you believe that this misinformation has been accelerated by state news propaganda outlets?
There's no question that it has become incredibly difficult to fight the machine, right? This sort of torrent, this tsunami of misinformation or kind of half truths. And I mean, Twitter is where this really takes on a life of its own. It's like people will latch onto like one sentence of a report of yours, take it out of context, put it with a photograph that's from a completely different, and then just put something out. And then it's not even as straightforward as issuing a flat out denial, because it's like, well, no, I did say that, but I was talking about this, and I was in that photo, but it was taken at that time. And so you find yourself, what I have found at this stage is like, you have to ignore it, actually. In the beginning, I used to try to really engage with it and be like, wait, this is incorrect, or I didn't say that. And now I'm like, it's a waste of time. And by the way, the thing about Twitter and all these memes and stuff, within 24 hours, everyone's forgotten about them. They're kind of just, they have a very short shelf life. So, and I feel the same way about like political attacks. Like, you know, in the beginning of my Afghanistan coverage, Senator Ted Cruz wrote something like very disparaging about me on Twitter. And, you know, like there was like a whole brouhaha. And honestly, people kept asking me about it. And I was like, I don't have time to be worried about like a mean tweet that a senator who is not risking his life in Afghanistan right now is writing. You know, I mean, like, it's a distraction. It's a distraction from the real issues, which are much more complex than any silly meme can really address. So I'm always torn, because I always want to like correct the record, and I always want to speak clearly about these issues. But I also know that you can get sucked down a rabbit hole when you do it. You can't change it. It's out there. Partly it's a product of like more nefarious actors willfully twisting things, and partly it's just lazy journalism. I wouldn't even really call it journalism, but it's just like clickbait, and how do I make this more exciting, and how do I go viral, and how do I attract people to my account? And there are a lot of reasons for it, and the best thing you can do, I believe, is to rise above it.
Yeah, thank you. Here's another one from the audience. After you witness all the human suffering and all these shocking events, how do you go about presenting these stories in a manner that properly gives the stories and the people associated justice?
I mean, I think it's such a good question. And there's no question, it's like, this is a huge responsibility you have. People are taking you into their lives at their most vulnerable and painful moments. And part of your job is to give a voice and to shine a light, but it's also to do justice to those stories. And so for me, that's a responsibility that I take so seriously. It's like a sacred responsibility to me. And I don't care what senators on either side of the aisle, honestly, are tweeting about my pieces. But if somebody who has trusted me with their story felt like I had like egregiously wronged them, or told their story in a way that was factually incorrect or unfair, like that would weigh heavily on me, and that would be very difficult for me. At the same time, you do have to have enough distance emotionally to do your job. You're not a cheerleader for any one party in any given scenario or conflict. And I am also not afraid to point out harsh truths. I mean, my first 60 Minutes piece from Syria, I addressed the fact, this was early on in 2012, that the rebels were being cannibalized by militant Islamists. And I faced a huge backlash from Syrian activists who knew it was true, but who worried that I was jeopardizing the cause by being open and transparent about that story. And that was painful for me, because a lot of those activists had risked their lives to help me tell these stories. But at the same time, it was the right thing to do. And so I could live with that. So yes, you want to do justice, and you want to give everything you can to, giving people, especially if you're talking about death or something, giving people the dignity in death that they had in life, and humanizing their stories and making them real. But you also have to know when to do the right thing journalistically and say, I may feel enormous sympathy for your cause, but I can also see what's happening over here, and I have to talk about that, even if you would rather I didn't.
Thank you so much. Another question is, where do you find the courage to do your job, and how are you able to deal with the trauma that you've experienced?
So I don't really view it. I guess it sounds weird because I know to everybody else it seems like I'm very brave. I definitely get told all the time that I'm brave. I don't particularly think of myself as being that brave. And perhaps like within the context of war reporters, I don't think I stand out as being exceptionally brave. There are people who've done like way crazier stuff than I have. So, but in terms of like what inspires me to keep doing work that is certainly not without risk, I would say it's just this idea of like, I have always been preoccupied with wanting to get to stories that I feel like other people aren't getting to. So for years in Afghanistan, I was just obsessed with like, I'm like, I want to go and spend time with the Taliban. And everyone's like, yeah, that's not really possible. You can't do that. They'll kidnap you, blah, blah, blah. And eventually I worked out a way to do it. I had to crack that code, not because I like danger or anything but because I was like, we can't be telling this story constantly and not understanding the enemy, right? Like it's ludicrous. Like we're missing a big part of the puzzle here. So I think that's a huge part of what motivates me. I want to get to the stories and the people who we're not hearing from.
Thank you. Here's the last audience question. We are running out of time here, just about at the end. So I'll try to keep it brief. What was the best advice you were told going through your journey as a journalist? And the second part of the question, I'm just kind of editing it down a little bit, is there are different views about whether you should jump straight into journalism or pursue graduate school. What do you think is the best way, or
I mean, I didn't go to graduate school, and that's really because like by my senior year of college, I was like ready to be done with college. But it really depends on the individual. It's not necessarily everyone who's going to want to go and like work on the overnight assignment desk at Fox and then move to the Middle East without a job and just sort of try to make it work. There isn't a one size fits all approach. Like you have to go with where your strengths lie, and you have to build up your knowledge. I mean, the best advice is like find a mentor. Find a mentor. And when you start working in an organization, it doesn't need to be the big boss at the top. It doesn't need to be the chief correspondent. It just is someone who has more experience than you, who can help you learn. Because I don't care how smart you are or how well-intentioned you are or how well-read you are. When you start out as a journalist, you know nothing. Even if you went to grad school, you still know nothing. Like this is a job that you can only learn on the ground when you're making these decisions, you're faced with these ethical dilemmas, you're charged with telling people's stories, you're learning how to operate in very difficult and dangerous environments. And the way you learn on the ground is through mentors, is through people who are more experienced than you, who are wiser and who are generous with wanting to share what they've learned. And that's why I always have had a rule that if any young aspiring journalist calls me, and believe me, this rule has come back to haunt me because sometimes I get like 50 emails a week from people, but I will talk to everyone because I really think when you do this work and you get that experience, and it's such a rare experience, like you have to pay it forward. So, and I think a lot of people think like I do. So don't ever feel you need to be so confident. You can be humble. You don't need to be, self-deprecating or kind of bowing and scraping, but you can be humble about what you don't know. And you can go to someone who has more experience and be like, hey, I know how busy you are, but it'd be amazing if you could just give me some insights into, an experience you've had, or, and also the last thing I'll say on this, because I'm mindful of everyone's time, is that it's not just correspondence you're going to learn from, especially in television. Go make friends with the cameraman. Go learn how editing works. Storytelling for a visual medium has many different components. And you need to go and talk to the tech people, because by the way, technology is now a huge part, or like has a huge role in how we work in these environments. And if you can't operate the BGAN or the live view, and I don't expect any of you guys to know what that is now, but at some point you will, then you're toast, right? So this is like, you need to be open to just learning on all fronts, everywhere you go, everyone you meet, and shadowing people, and being humble, but being curious, and being helpful, and don't get preoccupied with like what your station is and whether something's too menial for you, or when I started out, you're making coffee, you're printing things out for people. Like, it's just honestly, and maybe this is kind of not a very popular view anymore, like it's just a privilege to be in the room and watch people who in any craft are at the top of their game, and just to get into that room is a really big deal. So if you do get into it, even at the most junior level, embrace whatever your duties are that are not obviously in your heart, your dream come true duties, but they allow you to be in that room and to learn from the people and pick their brains and find mentors. And that is what will set you on your path.
Okay, thank you so much, Clarissa. I think we are out of time, but I think it's such a great way to end with your final advice. Be humble, be curious, and be open to learning. I think this is a very, very great message to end this conversation. And thank you so much for taking time and for being with us today. I think we all learned a lot. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Matt and Angelina, for your questions. They were really thoughtful, and I so enjoyed our conversation. And I see a lot of questions in the Q&A chat that we didn't get around to, but I thank all of you for just being engaged on important issues like this. So thank you so much for having me.